Good evening. Welcome to the Spring 2024 Green Living Seminar at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. This is an annual lecture series hosted here at MCLA each spring semester, and these lectures are sponsored by the Environmental Studies Department and generous donors to MCLA. Thank you to each one of you in the audience for attending tonight's lecture. This year's lecture series is entitled Greening New England. Each week's lecture will highlight the organizations, achievements, and ongoing efforts that are making New England more sustainable. Tonight's talk will highlight the work of one of the pillars of land conservation in Western Massachusetts. Since 1967, the Berkshire Natural Resources Council has been working to ensure that the green forests, clean rivers, and productive farms of the Berkshires stay healthy for all who depend on them. As of today, the BNRC directly cares for over 25,000 acres in our region, which by my calculation is 4% of the land area of Berkshire County. For another comparison, BNRC land area makes up twice the size of comparable to Mt Greylock State Reservation. In other words, BNRC is a major player in land protection and stewardship in our county. And there's no one better suited to tell us more about the Berkshire Natural Resources Council than the BNRC president, Jenny Hansell. And tonight we're especially fortunate to have her here to tell us about the work of BNRC. Jenny's life journey started in Massachusetts, where she was born in Boston, and she spent many significant and important tenures in various other parts of the United States, including Detroit, New York, Connecticut, and others. And then in 2018, Jenny moved back to Massachusetts, specifically to Berkshire County, to become the third president of the Berkshire Natural Resources Council. Jenny's talk tonight is entitled Land Trusts, Conservation and Access in Community as Climate Solution. And please help me welcome Jenny to MCLA.
Sorry about this. I've been fighting a cough for weeks now. Thank you, Dan. It's really nice to be here. And I'm always excited to share information about BNRC and what we're up to with as many people as I can, because it feels more urgent than ever to be doing land conservation work and to talk about how land conservation work fits into the bigger picture of climate resiliency and community resiliency. I want to mention that I'm not the only BNRC person here today. Johnny Robinson, who's sitting over here, is the newest person on our staff. He does land conservation work with us, and I'm sure if you have any specific questions about how that all works, he'd be glad to jump in a little bit later on. Excuse me, I'm gonna cough again. So because many of you, I think, are undergraduates, I decided after a little bit of back and forth with Dan that I really wanted to focus on what is a land trust, what does that even mean, and really give an overview of all of the different kinds of work we do, because you may be thinking about whether it's a career path you might want to take. You know, what are the different paths, you know, if you're interested in a career in the environmental world, there's a lot of different roles one can play, and a lot of different skill sets that are valuable in an organization like ours. And it's also just, I think, helpful to understand, I think, that the challenges that we face and some of the policy decisions that we have to make and some of the trade-offs that we have to make as we're moving forward in making the choices that we make. So I'm going to explain the basics of a land trust is an organization that conserves land. We are one of many organizations that does that. You know, most of you are familiar with state parks, local parks, federal parks. All of that is land that is protected from development. So kept in its natural state in perpetuity. And so one of the things that's important about a nonprofit organization like BNRC is that we have to function in a way that we will be around in perpetuity to take care of it and to protect it and make sure that that the laws that are establishing that protection are followed after all of us are no longer here. As the director of BNRC, I'm not a scientist. But the decisions that I have to make, or that we as an organization have to make, are informed by science at every step of the way. What decisions we make about forest management or about invasive species control have to be informed by the latest science, and we have to be aware when that science is changing, as it often is. New information, new studies, and kind of balancing different needs and different requirements are always under discussion, let's say. So, and there's different stakeholders. We might have neighbors to a property that that have particular interests or concerns that lead us to decisions that we might make differently if there were no neighbors. Excuse me. If there were not neighbors around. So we're always facing those kinds of situations. And ultimately, the real question is, why does this work matter, and how does it lead us towards addressing the climate emergency that we're facing? And I think a lot of us at BNRC feel really lucky that we get to go to work every day and do work that actually makes a difference in what I think is the greatest crisis facing us as on the planet. The work we're doing will lead to a more climate resilient Berkshires, and a more climate resilient Berkshires is part of a more climate resilient region, New England, you know, and beyond. And when I talk about climate resiliency, and I'll get into that a little later, what do I mean by that? How do we define that? We're not just talking about for plants and animals, we're talking about for all of us who live here, because we're all interconnected. And you know, the Berkshires has always been a place where people lived in harmony with nature since, you know, for many thousands of years, since before colonial times, the people who lived here long before us. And there's a lot we can learn from that. So, and I think we still can. And again, there's a lot of trade-offs and a lot of balancing to do, and that's our job, is to be mindful of the fact that people need a place to live, people need a place to work, people need clean water, people need clean air, they need to be outside. We as a land trust have a role to play in all of that. So when we do our land acknowledgement, as we always do, it's not just words, because, again, we have the opportunity, and we have built on the opportunity to build a relationship with the Stockbridge-Munsee, and because the land that we are conserving, protecting, I put in quotes because there's sort of an irony here. There's members of the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe that I've spoken to who feel like protecting is a difficult word because it sort of implies protecting from whom, and that there was a kind of an implication that it was being taken from them in order to protect it from them, right? From the indigenous people who lived here. So that's a word that I sometimes don't feel comfortable using. However, the point is, we were able to do a project this year that resulted in 350 acres of land being returned to the Stockbridge-Munsee in their most sacred homeland in Stockbridge. They will now own that land and be able to do with it what they wish. And we played a central role in making that project happen. It's not acreage that you will see in a tally of acres owned by or cared for by BNRC. It's what we might call an assist, and again, another thing we'll talk about more a little bit later. But it's a project that we are incredibly proud of and hope to do many more of in the future. So this is the mission statement we've had for a very long time. I would say every year or two we go back to it and say, is this still true? Do we need to change this? Do we need to update it? Do we need to revise it? Is it really about natural beauty? Is it really about protect and preserve? What do we mean by ecological integrity? Who is the public and how are they benefiting? You know, we sort of do a deep dive on these words, but we always come back to saying, yeah, this is it. We're not changing it. Even with all of the changes and growth and expansion of our mission and programs, this still feels right to us, at least for now. And I want to talk a little bit about accreditation. This is something new. In 2023, we received accreditation from the Land Trust Alliance. What it means is that we went through an incredibly rigorous process of having our all of our work and all of our processes examined by the National Land Trust Alliance in 4 areas: our governance, finance, our stewardship, and our conservation records and processes. And we had to meet an extremely lengthy list of standards and practices, and at the highest level to receive accreditation. And we are one of, I think, about 400 accredited land trusts nationwide to be accredited. So we're very proud of that. It took about 1.5 years to go through the entire process. Tremendous amount of work, and going back to 1967, that's a lot of records to dig up and make sure that they all met, they were all at that level. But it was really well worth it. So we all have that symbol on our emails now. So we are, BNRC is a regional land trust working throughout and exclusively in Berkshire County. We are the only land trust that can say that. There are many organizations doing land conservation in the Berkshires. Statewide organizations like Mass Audubon, Trustees of Reservations certainly work here. Obviously, state agencies like DCR protect and hold a lot of land here. And there are a lot of local land trusts. About 12 towns have land trusts, all of which I believe were started kind of at the behest of BNRC's founder, George Wislocki, who thought back in the early days of BNRC that it would really work well if each town had its own volunteer-based land trust to work in partnership with us. So they would have that local relationship with the landowner, and we would have more of the expertise and the resources to work with them on projects. You'll see that word partner a lot in these slides, and nothing happens in isolation in work like this. Our partnerships are absolutely key. Obviously, a nonprofit can't function without donors and board members and volunteers and staff, but the organizations that we work with, such as local land trusts or state agencies or other nonprofits, which we'll talk about as we go on. We do these projects together, sharing resources, sharing expertise. The most important partner that we have in any land project is the landowner who has made the decision to do land, to conserve their land. Somebody who maybe, has lived on their property for generations and has been thinking about their legacy, what they would like to see happen with that property. And in many cases, we may have been in conversation with them for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and they weren't ready, and they weren't sure what their kids wanted to do, and maybe their kids would like to own or come back to that property, and then finally they decide it's time to put that land into conservation, and they move forward with us. And they won't do it if they don't trust us to handle it well, if they don't trust us to do it with respect for their wishes and what they'd like to see happen, and to honor their love for their land and the legacy that they want to leave. And so we have to do it with the highest integrity. And we have a phrase, I don't think we invented it, I've seen it other places, but that everything that we do moves at the speed of trust, and many of the relationships that we have with landowners go back decades. And so again, we talk about perpetuity, it's going back to 1967 and forward, who knows how many hundreds of years that we'll be continuing to build those relationships to make sure that when you're ready to protect your land, we're here and ready to work with you. So just a snapshot of the land that we hold in fee and in conservation restrictions. And again, I'll define those terms in a minute. We hold and protect a total of 25,000 acres, a little more, 25,200. Of that, 12,600 is conservation restriction, and the rest is held in fee. By in fee, I mean we actually own the land, and I'll define that in a little more detail in a second. We have 57 reserves, by which I mean properties that have a trailhead and a kiosk and trails, and you can go hiking there and find them on a map. We co-hold a number of properties with other organizations, and that chart just gives you an idea of sort of how it all breaks down. Now, the conservation restrictions are a key legal piece of any land conservation. A conservation restriction is a permanent restriction on the use or development of the land. Any land that's conserved has a conservation restriction on it, and it is held by somebody. In many cases, the land is still privately owned, so if you want to conserve your land, you might still own the land itself, but we or another entity like ours holds the conservation restriction. And that means that you have essentially given up your development rights. You can live on that land forever and sell it to somebody else, but it can never be developed. There would never be anything more built on it than is there today, or at least outside of the little building envelope that is defined by the conservation restriction. And Johnny, you may be sitting there thinking, that's a little untechnical language for describing how this works, but it's the general idea. As in the process of creating these conservation restrictions, you have to identify, why is this land worth conserving? It has to have conservation values. There has to be habitat. There has to be something that meets the definition of conservation land. It can't just be, a parking lot. And then it goes through a process of being approved by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There's a whole legal process it goes through. And then we have a responsibility. If we hold the conservation restriction, we have to go out there every year, walk around the boundary, check and make sure that you, as the owner, have not violated the terms and built a shed or a new house, or dug a hole somewhere where the restriction says you're not allowed to, or the neighbors haven't encroached on it. And if somebody's done something they weren't supposed to, we have to say, excuse me, sorry, it's not what's in the restriction, and we have to have that returned to the state that it was in. And again, it's in perpetuity, so if you sell the land, the next owner who buys it has to be made aware that they have to follow the terms of the restriction that you did. And it applies to them and to the next and to the next. One of the most important jobs that a land trust has is to sort of defend the conservation restriction. If somebody new comes in and buys it and says, well, wait a minute, I didn't really realize that I can never build, an addition onto my house. I'm going to go to court and try to get this undone. We have to be prepared, and that's a big part of the accreditation process, to make sure we have a big legal fund stashed away in case somebody, takes us to court to try to undo those CRs. We have to be prepared to defend that. So fee simple is the other half of that. That's when we own the property itself. In that case, sometimes we hold the conservation restriction piece of it as well, and sometimes somebody else might hold that, another conservation organization. So again, we only hold it, we only take it or buy it or accept the donation if it's important habitat. Is it threatened? Is it adjacent to other conservation properties? So if somebody comes to us and I've got, it's a small property, it's only 50 acres, but it adds on to a reserve that's already existing. Or that could exist in the future. Wildlife corridors are another incredibly important kind of land that we're interested in conserving. So a lot of the land that we're working on now is connecting one piece to another, especially as the climate changes and wildlife territories are shifting. Those corridors, and as development increases and the areas that wildlife and plants can live and shrink, those corridors become more important. And so we have a tremendous number of data sources that we consult. The mapping piece of this, as we're doing the research on which land to conserve, becomes a big part of it. The state of Massachusetts, the Nature Conservancy, and a number of other entities have created mapping layers. One of my colleagues, Adam Galambos, teaches a class here in GIS mapping, which Johnny is taking, that teaches how to use these resources. And so we sort of layer these maps on top of each other. So we look at Biomap 3 and the endangered species maps and so on to sort of figure, and then you go out and walk around and see, is there a vernal pool? Is it beautiful? Is this a place that just feels like one of those magical natural places that that needs to be protected? So it all factors into whether we make the decision to pursue it. But in particular, the Nature Conservancy's climate resiliency data layer has sort of risen to the top as one of the most important sources that we consult. So once we own it, in fee simple, we have full control over it. Again, I mentioned that there may be a conservation restriction on it, usually is. And then for us, for BNRC, providing public access is important to our mission. It's part of it. When that land was privately owned by a private landowner, it was their land. There may have been, social trails on it. People may have walked out of it. Generally, it was not open to the public. But for us, for the public benefit piece of it, there is a public benefit to protecting it from development, but it's also really important to us to allow the public to experience the benefits of being in nature. And when I think about the kinds of controversies and arguments that I hear from people, one of the arguments I hear from people is, why, are you letting people out into that beautiful, unspoiled piece of nature? Why don't we just protect it for the animals? And usually I hear that from people who own their own property and have plenty of nature that they can go into every day if they want to. And so I think about protecting, creating trails and creating access for people who don't have their own 300-acre backyard that they can enjoy and pass on to their children. We all found out during COVID, if we didn't already know, how critical it is to have access to the outside for our mental and spiritual and physical health. And in the early days of COVID, we found out, in those first couple of weeks, that other conservation organizations like Mass Audubon and trustees were closing their trails. And staff asked me, are we closing our trails? And I said, I thought about it for a minute. I said, well, they have bathrooms and buildings and facilities. They have to shut everything down. We don't. We only have outdoors. We are not shutting down. We're keeping everything open. So we made a bunch of signs with pictures of eagles on them, because eagles have 6-foot wingspans, and put those signs up and said, please keep a wingspan between you and the next person on the trail. That was the wisdom that we were given from the CDC, is stay 6 feet away from everybody. We kept every trail open. All of our staff, nobody was laid off because everybody was out on the trail, keeping the trails open. And people got to be outside when they couldn't do anything else. I don't know if you remember, 4 years ago, I should do, I feel like lives were saved by being able to get out there on the trail. So I feel very passionate about the importance of that. And BNRC, we allow every nonprofit or every sort of conservation organization makes its own decisions about what kinds of activities they allow on their properties. We are pretty open. We don't allow passive recreation of all kinds. There's no motorized vehicles, but pretty much anything else goes, including hunting. That's our sort of long history with sportsmen is a big part of our legacy. And almost all of our properties allow hunting on them. So just take care to wear orange during the season and be aware of when they are. A third kind of conservation is less frequently talked about, but because of our long distance trail network, the high road that we'll talk about in a minute, the trail easements and rights of way are really important as well. Often what that looks like is somebody, owns their land, but they convey to us an easement over a very particular path. So we have the right to put a trail across their land connecting one conservation area to another. So I just want to talk about assists for a minute, because Dan mentioned that we own or hold about 4% of the land of the conserved land in Berkshire County. Berkshire County is about 600,000 acres. About 40% of that is conserved. We've been trying to add up how much of that land we've kind of had a hand in that we haven't ended up owning ourselves. I would say at least 4 or 5 times more than what we hold ourselves, we've had a role to play. And usually what that looks like is, let's say Massachusetts has their eye on a big piece of property that the Mass Fish and Wildlife would like to protect, but it takes them a long period of time to allocate the funds from the state budget. It might take them 18 months to do that. We are nimble. We have funds reserved for doing the kind of early steps that you have to do land conservation, the survey and the sort of title work and the kinds of due diligence that have to happen, or get the option on the property to work with the landowner, because landowners are often in a hurry. They need the money now, they need to sell, they need to move on, they don't want to wait 18 months for the state. So we can do all of that groundwork, we can line up the financing, work with the state, sometimes even pre-acquire the property and hold it until the state is ready to take it, and then ultimately sell it back to Massachusetts. They own it, it gets added on to Berkshire State Forest or whatever it might be. And so it looks like, in a way we don't get the credit because we don't own the land, but we played an incredibly important early role in making that land conservation happen. And, as I think about what we have to do going forward, that idea of not taking the credit becomes even more important. All of us conservation organizations working together are sort of looking at how much conservation needs to happen in order to be as climate resilient as possible. And we're all sort of talking about sharing the same goal, 100,000 acres in Massachusetts by 2030. And it doesn't matter who owns it in the end, who gets the credit. As long as somebody does it, and we're all helping each other, we're sharing our expertise and sharing the money and sharing the workload. If none of it ends up on that little chart of ours at the end of by 2030, but it's all done and we helped, that's great. So this is just a selection of some of the organizations that we partner with on land conservation projects. So when I think about 4 to 5 times as much as what we hold, probably 100,000 more acres we've done since one of these days we'll go through all of those folders and come up with a real number. So just in 2023, here's a couple of projects that we worked on. Fen Farm is the one in Stockbridge that went back to the Stockbridge-Muncie. And that was a really interesting one because there was a lot of pressure to hurry up. There was an agency that just was worried that, the seller wanted to hurry up and sell it. We need to buy it. We need to get it off the market. But our team felt like we needed to take our time and let the tribe go through its own process, take as long as it needed to take to decide what it wanted to do, and slowed it all down and said, we're just going to wait. They have their own timeline, and if they want to own it, we're going to let them take the lead, and that's how it ended up going. The Conkapot Ridge project is one that ended up being about 780 acres, but it connected up, I talked about wildlife corridors before, connected up a total of 14,000 acres that had been fragmented and now is connected. The Curling property, which is in Lakesboro, so if you notice if you know where all these towns are, you'll notice they're sort of scattered all over the county. We work north to south, everywhere in the county. That's really important because it creates a connection for the High Road, which is a project that's, I'll talk about a little more in a few minutes, that's a network of trails connecting town to trail throughout the county, a multi-generation project that will result in long-distance trails across the county. And then we have multiple projects underway for 2024. I think at some point I totaled up something like 3,000 acres of projects under development at the moment. So again, why? For climate resilience. Climate resilience is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events, trends, or disturbances related to climate. So, in the case of land conservation, protecting habitat to ensure greater biodiversity, promoting carbon sequestration and storage in forests, conserving watershed lands to keep drinking water safe, and reducing flood risk, for example. You could come up with many more examples than that. Climate resilience is also resilience for human beings and for human communities, helping connect people to nature for their physical and mental health, supporting local food systems, and contributing to larger efforts to make sure that people of the Berkshires can continue to live and work here. And that's not always an obvious role for a land trust to play. What does that mean for a land trust to contribute to the larger efforts of, helping people live and work here? Well, for example, many land trusts right now are asking themselves, is there a role to play in the affordable housing crisis in my community? And is there a conflict there? And The answer is yes, there is a role. There's absolutely a role, and there are a lot of parcels of land that that could be developed for housing, that if a land trust got involved in the conservation of it, could result in more housing being built and more land being protected at the same time, because housing could be clustered instead of spread out with big lots. So sorry, keep doing that. So the lots would be smaller, making the houses more affordable, and there'd be more contiguous land left undeveloped. So that's a lot to sort of throw out, and just sort of a side comment. I'd be happy to talk about that more. But thank you. Sorry, I gesture a lot. But that's the kind of thing that every land trust across the country, as far as I know, is starting to think about and starting to explore. Or certainly every land trust living in a place like the Berkshires, where affordable housing is a big issue. And so we've had a number of conversations with affordable housing commissions in towns and with groups like Construct about whether the opportunities might arise. And we actually have a parcel of land that was given to us as what we call trade lands. Sometimes somebody who wants to support BNRC will give us a parcel of land with the express understanding that it does not have conservation value. It's not really conservation land, but that we could sell it and use the proceeds for another conservation project down the road. And we have a parcel like that now that would potentially be a great spot for affordable housing. So we're looking at whether we could partner with the town where that land is, sell it to them, use that money for conserving a valuable piece of land, and they could move forward with affordable housing in the community. Not our job to develop, see, I gestured too much. It is not our job to develop housing. It is our job to conserve land, that we can be in conversation with organizations like that and work together and bring the values of conservation and the ideas of conservation into a larger community conversation about how to accomplish multiple goals at the same time. So when I think about all of the work that we've been doing, and I think about what we're facing now, we have to keep doing all of this work more, faster, better, and bring all of this urgency back into these conversations. So what we've done recently is develop more specific, a strategic conservation plan that kind of takes our values and how we define how conservation and climate resilience and community resilience can inform our decisions around land conservation and what land we choose to conserve. I mean, there's a certain amount of, I think historically we know it when we see it. You know when you look at a parcel of land if it's good land worth conserving or not, and you have all these maps. And you also, there's a certain amount of projects come to you, right? You can't necessarily look at the map and say, I'll take that one, and that one. You take the ones that the landowner calls you and says, I'd like to talk to you about conserving my land. However, I think we can, and many organizations are now looking at ways to be more proactive and to be more intentional about identifying areas that we can do more targeted outreach. So for example, so what we've done is, and Adam, the colleague that I mentioned who does the mapping class here, has developed something called the geospatial model. And what he's done is taken all of our criteria and our values and created scoring where we've sort of weighted the different things according to our own BNRC priorities and sort of identified the most high priority parcels and areas within the Berkshires. And so this is sort of an early draft. So we have identified acreage that sort of meets these high priority goals, and then you can sort of draw circles around the areas that light up the brightest red or orange, and then you can start knocking on doors, writing letters, connecting to the landowners there. And we've been doing that in a couple of targeted areas already, working in partnership, there's that word again, with, there's an organization in the Pioneer Valley that has a project that's kind of crosses the border into Berkshire County that we've been doing some outreach around, and there's another project that we're developing with Mass Audubon, where we can just go down the list of landowners and start letting them know that, hey, your land is really important, it's part of this bigger corridor. If you're ever interested, we can just come share some information, let you know what your options are. When you're ready, we're here. And have that kind of, just sort of prepare the way so that if there's a time that they're ready, we're there. So, a big piece of this, and a kind of land that we have worked on some over the years, but that is highly endangered in particular, and that we're doing much more on now, is farmland. Farmland is incredibly important in the Berkshires, as it is everywhere, for so many reasons. Obviously for the vibrant local food system and for the agricultural community. Farmland also provides important habitat. It's part of the ecological makeup of the Berkshires. Farm soils sequester and store carbon at high levels. And there's a role that we can play in helping farmers get access to farmland, which is incredibly expensive because it's so easily developed. There is flat. The trees are already gone. It's there's big road frontage. It's very easy for somebody to come along and buy these farms. So those lands sell at a much higher price than your average plot of forest land. So, for example, as I said, it's highly attractive to developers. So in the last decade, we've already lost 10% of our farms. A third of farmers in the Berkshires are over 65. How many of their kids want to come in and take over the farm? If they don't, what's going to happen to that farm? It's very easy to just put it on the market and sell and retire. It's very hard to find a young new farmer who can afford to buy that farm. That's the role that we can play to help find ways to ease that transition. Dairies in particular are struggling the most. So one of the strategies that we can use, and that we've just completed our first land transaction in this methodology, is called Buy, Protect, Sell. So we just purchased a farm in Clarksburg. We will put it under protection. There's a kind of protection called agricultural preservation restriction that's very similar to a conservation restriction. What that does is kind of extinguish the development rights. It no longer can be developed, and that reduces the resale value to the next purchaser. So that makes it more affordable for the young farmer who might want to come in and buy it. In this case, we've identified the farmer. She's going to lease it for a couple of years while she builds her business. She's sort of doing a lease to own situation. So we're able to kind of bridge a period of time. And because we're a nonprofit who has this as our mission, we can raise some money to kind of fund the gap there and sort of support this as a program and a project to kind of help create a revolving loan fund, for example. So we're able to do this right now kind of on a one farm at a time scale. I think I'm sensing there's a lot of interest and support for this in the Berkshires, and I'm hoping we can scale this up as part of our goal of greater resiliency in the Berkshires. How are we doing on time here? There's so much to talk about. I'm at 40. I'll just whip along here, and when you want me to stop, just tell me. Caring for the land is another huge part of what we do. We conserve it, and we have to care for it. Some of the land that we take might have invasive plants. We have to care for the trails, build and care for the trails. The reserves that we own are sort of the public face of BNRC. If you show up at Olivia's Overlook or the Hoosick Range, which is very close to MCLA, that might be the only time you ever encounter the name BNRC. In fact, you may be walking on the Hoosick Range Trail every other day and not even know it's the BNRC trail. Hopefully you do, because we have pretty good signs, but it's a way that we convey who we are to you. So it's really important to us that the trails are well maintained and that the property is, that we have good relationships with the neighbors. And, we're constantly making management decisions on our reserves about forestry, for example. And we definitely don't have time to get into this. I wish we did. Decisions about active forest management versus letting the forest do what they're going to do. Or about wildlife management. We had a big kerfluffle, a big controversy at one of our reserves over the summer because we have an accessible trail at one of our reserves, and the beavers had flooded the trail. There's a pond next to the trail, and it flooded so that it was no longer accessible for wheelchairs and walkers and that kind of thing. And so we put in a device called a beaver deceiver, which is a very low-tech, very brilliant device that just kind of keeps the water level stable. It's not very attractive. It annoyed the beavers, so they moved downstream a little bit, but people got very upset. They thought we killed the beavers. We got hate mail, anonymous letters, angry phone calls, all of it. So we put up a little sign at the location with a QR code that said, "The beavers are fine, we promise. Click on the QR code and it'll take you to our webpage where you'll read all about it." But, you know, those are decisions that we have to make, balancing the needs of the wildlife and the needs of the people who are using that property. I talked a little bit about conservation restrictions already. The stewardship side of it, again, is monitoring them, you know, making sure that we are honoring that long-term commitment to keep them from being developed and sort of honoring that legal agreement. Our trail building is a huge part of what we do. I mentioned already that providing access is really important, but there's another piece of it. If you have a sensitive ecological area, where you put the trail is the best thing you can do. Sort of that decision is the best way you can protect the resource, because if it's open to the public and people can just walk anywhere, they will walk anywhere and they'll put social trails all over the place. If you put the trail here away from the vernal pool, you know, you can direct them where you want them to go and protect the resources. And so we are very thoughtful about making them sustainable. If you build them right the first time, they need less maintenance. And doing so in a way that's very respectful of the sort of environmental, you know, the habitat and the ecological needs of the site. And also curating an experience that is the most beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. You know, designing a trail is an artistic endeavor. We have over 60 miles of trail with more under development all the time, and I think one of the things we've realized is that our trails are very high quality. They're not all easy, they're not all accessible, but they're all really well built and well designed. You know, when you climb over that stonework, you don't necessarily realize that that was put there by somebody. But it was put there by somebody for a reason, to direct the water off the trail or to keep it from eroding. You know, if you walk down the trail and you see that there's all those kind of muddy trails going wider and wider around because it's too mucky in the middle, that's a trail that was not well designed to begin with. And I don't think you see that too often on BNRC trails. More and more, we're looking for opportunities to build fully accessible trails, because if you've ever been to Parsons Marsh down in Lenox, or Thomas and Palmer in Great Barrington, and the old mill in, the closest one to here is the old mill in Hinsdale. It's not fully accessible right now, but there's parts of it that are. You know, when you see somebody who's older out there who's using their rollator walker, and they'll, you know, stop to talk to them, and they might tell you, I haven't been able to get outside like this in 10 years, and finally I can get back out into nature. And, or somebody's out there in a wheelchair or with their stroller. It's life-changing for people. So, you know, some of the things, you know, again, sustainable design, this constant sort of process of design. And again, it's very, very technical, stonework and, you know, the sort of slope of the treadway and all the kinds of design things that go into it that are really fascinating when you dig into it. Our trail crew is, the equipment they use is, you know, we have whole presentations just about that, and you could do a deep dive just into trail design. You know, the biggest challenge in trail design is the elements themselves. As one of my team said to me recently, water and feet are the biggest problems with trails. Those are the things that break them down and that you have to plan for. And again, balancing the needs of humans and nature, like I was describing with the beavers. So a little bit about the high road. This was dreamed up by my predecessor, Ted Ames, as a very ambitious, multi-generational project. He was inspired by the long-distance walking trails that have existed in Europe for 1,000 years, coast-to-coast trails. The idea is ultimately a trail that you could walk, not like the Appalachian Trail that's necessarily a camping trail, but from town to town or from food to food is a phrase we use sometimes. I think through the pandemic, we started thinking of it more as town to trail, as a way of getting people who don't have access to the outdoors to be able to walk into town or walk into nature. So some of the projects we're working on right now are really focused on walking from North Adams up to the Visick Range, walking from Pittsfield up to the Yukon Ridge, which is our first high road connection. So the first one that opened a couple years ago connects Mahanacobble and Pittsfield, goes across Yokonseet, Lennox Mountain down to Kripalu and Olivia's Overlook. It's about 8 miles from end to end, but has multiple spurs, so there's about 10 miles of trail. And then this summer we're going to add a connection to Pittsfield. And then, as I said, there's three or four projects that are under development right now throughout the county, and then ultimately, by 2030, I think we'll have routes throughout the county, and perhaps by the end of the century, it'll be fully connected up. We'll see. Community programs, so much to talk about, the multiple ways that we work with kids and with community organizations. We talked a little bit about the accessible trails and the multiple partners we work with. One of the things that we realized that there are so many people in the Berkshires who don't feel comfortable hiking. They didn't grow up hiking. They don't feel welcome. They don't fit the profile, let's say, of the person that you see on the trail. So we've created things like the Everybody Can Hike brochure that just sort of explains things like what to bring and what's sort of the protocols and how people act on the trail and how do you go to the bathroom out there and things that nobody's really going to tell you. And then a brochure that's all the accessible trails in the Berkshires, not just BNRC trails, but everybody's accessible trails. We have translated all of our materials, our trail brochures and maps into Spanish, and we have a number of Spanish language resources, programs that are in Spanish. Story walks are an example of a kind of project that we've done that started during the pandemic because they were kind of a self-guided project. You sort of post these pages from books on trees and at eye level for children, and they can walk around the reserve and read a story about a naturalist or a butterfly or whatever it is. And again, we have them in English and in Spanish. And then we have just so many different online offerings, courses like we just had a beaver session online a couple days ago, and then a huge volunteer program. I think something like 100 active volunteers right now doing various projects. They're trail stewards and building trails and working in the office. And very often when I go out and meet volunteers on the trail, I'll meet somebody who says, I always wanted to do this for a living, but I felt like my family wanted me to go to law school, so I had a desk job for 45 years, and now finally I'm retired and I get to do what I always wanted to do and be out on the trail. One of the things we did this year is do a pretty thorough community survey so that we could make sure that our community programs are meeting the needs of the people that we're working with. So not just us saying, oh, we think that people want story walks or nature backpacks or whatever it is, but really hear from folks what it is that they're looking for. And design programs to meet their needs. So I just want to make a mention of the fact that diversity, equity, if it isn't obvious already, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a huge part of the way we think about the work. Conservation has a very racist past. not just who the land was taken away from, but, you know, I'm sure you've heard John Muir was a eugenicist. John James Audubon enslaved people. There's a lot to reckon with in our history, and we are doing our best to reckon with it. And so we've done a lot of work to think about not just that history, but what does it look like? Why is it that the sort of typical staff person at a nature organization is a white guy in a flannel shirt? Why are other people not coming forward to work at organizations like ours, and how can we change that, for example? So I think we've made a lot of progress. We are partnering with a lot of organizations that are helping us change the way we think, our organizational culture. And we're always learning. We are always open to doing better. And I think as the leader of an organization, I feel really strongly that the way you make change is that the leadership shows up and makes that commitment, spends money on it. There's a budget line for all of this work. We hire consultants that help us move this forward. If you don't put it front and center, it's not going to happen. So I'm very much running out of time here, so I'm going to skip over this, but happy to talk about it more in the question and answer. I'm going to skip over this, just gives an idea of the kinds of jobs there are at an organization like ours. Can't do the work that we do without raising a whole lot of money to do it. A lot of it comes from individual donors, a lot of it comes from grants. We have an app, it's fantastic, check it out. And I just want to talk a little bit about our goals going forward to 2030 for a second. And there's an asterisk here for a reason. I told you that we hold 25,000 acres of land. That's from 1967 to now, 57 years. In the next 6 years, we need to conserve another 20,000 acres, including 5,000 acres of farmland. Did I mention the farm we just did, that we just closed on, was 18 acres? We've got a lot of work to do. We have 8 miles of high road right now. We need to build 30 by 2030. We have 3 accessible trails now. We need many more. And we do need to take a more active role in managing our forests, because forest management, thoughtful recreation of old growth conditions is what is going to create the most old growth-like conditions, which is what is going to lead to the greatest carbon sequestration and storage, and the greatest biodiversity, which leads to the greatest climate resilience. That is a hot take. Not everybody agrees with that. And continue those partnerships and developing our ability to listen to what the community needs and wants from us, to make sure that we're always of service to the people who are in need of more connection to nature. And the reason there's an asterisk is because this, as our strategic goals, is going in front of my board on Monday at our board meeting, and these will become our official goals if they vote yes on Monday. Sorry, went a little. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, why don't we take maybe 2 or 3 quick questions, and then we'll leave some time if people want to come up on that.
Sure, I did not time that very well. Sorry about that. I'm going to start with students if they have questions. I saw your hand raised. Go ahead.
How does BNRC decide to partner with other organizations? Do you partner with youth groups like Scouts and 4-H?
We do. It sort of evolves organically in a way. It depends on what the project is, and yeah, we partnered with 4-H. There hasn't been a big overlap with their mission, although as we get more into farm work, I could see there might be a lot of potential there. We're always open to new partnerships.
I might have missed this when you were talking about it, but where does BNRC primarily draw funding from?
So we have a very robust fundraising program from individuals. So, just those fundraising letters and me going out and asking people for donations. Our operating budget, which is, what covers staff and operations, is about $1.5 million. Most of that comes from individuals. And then a lot of funding for the project, so the acquisition cost of a parcel of land comes from foundations or government funding. The state of Massachusetts has a number of different programs, like something called the Landscape Partnership Grant, for example, which for a big, large-scale project can come up with a significant amount of money. And so a lot of those projects will have, like a portion of that will cover the staff time that it takes to do the project. Yep.
This is a difficult question, and you're welcome to take a pass if you don't want to talk about it. But a few years back, I think there was some conflict with BNRC about wind turbines on the property. And, it felt like the environment versus the environment, that battle. And so I was wondering kind of where the organization is on that right now.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I feel like the time is right to take another look at those questions. That was before my time, and I remember being really surprised when I learned about it. I certainly understand why, what came up at that time was there was and correct me if you probably remember, that you were probably here and I wasn't, but there was a desire to put wind turbines to develop energy, but in a place that was on mountaintops, and BNRC's position was it destroyed the natural beauty of the area, which is part of our mission, to protect the natural beauty. It's also been a BNRC sort of reflexive position to be pretty against most solar sightings, like, solar should be on brownfields, period, end of story. I think it's more nuanced than that, and I think that in the strategic plan that I presented to the board to vote on Monday, there's a section about it's time for BNRC to dig back into those questions, because we have to divest from fossil fuels, and BNRC has to figure out how to do that. So I don't think I would be in favor of wind turbines on top of Mt Greylock today, but there, I'm sure there's other alternatives that we could be looking at.
I'm going to invite you to come down with any other questions, and let's thank you.